Welcome back. So in this video, we're talking about the role of political parties, right, in shaping how Congress works, what it does, and of course the outputs we get, and particularly how it can be problematic. So if you look, right, at this opening graphic here, this is the distance between the average Democrat and average Republican in the House and Senate on an ideological measure called DW nominate. And essentially, if you look at this, right, so a higher value means there's more polarization. You can see that when we think of kind of the classic Congress in the middle of the 20th century and kind of through these eras, right, they're actually at a low point of polarization. That today, right, the House and Senate are more divided than they've been essentially ever. We see polarization in the late 19th century, some of which we talked about regarding this last week when we talked about political parties. These divides, right, are really stark today. And these divides mean that there are a lot of issues for how Congress actually does things. So in the next video, we're going to talk about how a bill becomes law, the actual process for making legislation. But in this video, I want to focus on organizational structures, particularly partisanship. And so if you talk about the House and Senate and the way in which they're organized, you typically have three kind of organizational structures. And Professor Boucher will talk about some of these in other videos too, right? And these help organize all the people. So you have, right, 435 members of the U.S. House, plus there's 6 non-voting members that represent the various territories as well as the District of Columbia. And you have 100 senators. And so one kind of organizational way, right, is it's not just these individual people, but all of them have their own staffs, which assist them in doing casework and the other things I talked about in kind of the previous video, that are located in both in the district or the state if you're in the Senate, or Washington, D.C. There are also committees, right, where you divide the labor and divide basically the expertise, right, into various areas. So you have committees for particular policy topics. And kind of overarching over both of these is you have parties, right, that help kind of organize or whip, right, or get people in line to vote a particular way, or to log roll, right, to vote trade, or kind of build legislation that makes a lot of people happy. Members of Congress, right, which are abbreviated MCs there, right, and to help with re-election campaigns. And parties have an integral role in all of these structures, right, and it's impossible to kind of overstate, right, how important they are. So when we think about the parties, and here I'm generally speaking about, right, the party in government. We talked about the different faces of parties last week, right, as these are the legislators themselves. And parties originally form in Congress, right, in the first Congresses, because party members share policy goals, right? They're Republicans because they support many of the things other Republicans support, right? They're Democrat because they support many of the things other Democrats support. And there are obviously occasionally differences within the parties. Or not just occasionally, there are differences within the parties, but they may not be super apparent to us on everything. Right? But this means that they focus and kind of coordinate strategy on legislation. They build an agenda of particular things and topics that they want to get passed or they're able to get passed, sometimes in coordination with the president, particularly if the president of the same party. But they have people, right, responsible for working on it in committee, for drafting it, for building broad coalitions, for trying to get everyone on board, or everyone, enough people on board in order to get the legislation passed through the process. Right. And they have, right, often a party agenda. They have particular goals that the members have settled on within their caucus, right, or kind of the meeting of the party, right, of all its members, and getting this agenda. And last video, we talked a lot about the re-election incentive. And of course, party members also want to be re-elected here. And often, right, these work in the same way, right, is you want to build a powerful party reputation and not make your party, whether it's the Democrats or Republicans, look bad, right, is you want to give or get things done so you can say, hey, look what we did. But you also want to stop policies from the other party so they can't take credit for it, or that they can't kind of make a pitch to voters and help them beat you. Right. So, a lot of really useful strategies around building the reputation here, both through getting things done, but also trying to send messages by making the other party take awkward votes that put them in positions by offering amendments to legislation or things that force them to vote down what sounds like a popular thing in service of a good campaign ad. And of course, members of Congress also pay dues to their party. So they not only fundraise, right, to support themselves, but they fundraise to support other members of Congress, particularly those that might be in more vulnerable positions. Right? It's kind of like an insurance program, is right, is you're all in it together, and the party will divide resources and push resources to those that might most need it, assuming they've been loyal and good to the party. This allows the party, right, to often hold things over members' heads, right, and get them in line for particular votes because the party can bring lots of resources to bear. Um, Parties also determine a lot, right, about how the chamber actually works, right, and many of the rules that we'll talk about in the next video and kind of how a bill becomes law, right, are set by the parties or could be changed by the parties. But the committee one gets put on, right, the staff that you often end up with, right, are partly determined and partly kind of given resources, right, by the party here as well. And so it's, again, it's impossible to overstate the role here. And if you look at how the chambers are organized, and particularly their leadership, they're central, right? Parties are central to this as well. So here, there's a screenshot from the House, the House.gov website, right, that lays out the kind of the organizational structure for the House. Right, the most prominent, powerful person in the House is the Speaker, typically, basically always, and it's currently Nancy Pelosi, right, who is a Democrat. And so the speakership, right, goes to the most prominent member of the majority party because the Democrats have the majority. You see the rest of the Democratic leadership team here, so Steny Hoyer, James Clyburn, right, and so on, right, and you have a caucus chairman, right, so you have a caucus, or the meeting of the whole party, so all members of the Democratic Party are members of this Democratic caucus. You can see the Republican on the right here. The Republican leader, right, notably, you would refer to, right, the Steny Hoyer as the majority leader, right, and Kevin McCarthy is a minority leader because Republicans are currently in the minority in the House. And there are many other members of these parties, right, that are in leadership roles of various types, but these are the most senior, right, and kind of these are names you might see on TV or see in the news quite a bit. These are the ones coordinating, right, a lot of the activity and trying to build the party and, right, and build a party brand that helps them get reelected. If you turn to the Senate, right, the Senate, right, despite having 100 people versus 441 or 435 voting members, right, they have a lot more people in various roles here, right, because everyone wants to feel important and get something to do. So there are mandated officers from the Constitution, right, so Vice President Pence, whoever the vice president is, right, has a role, right, in kind of leading the Senate. You have the president pro tem, which, unlike the speaker, where the speaker has lots of power and a real kind of powerful role, the president pro tem is largely just honorary, and currently Chuck Grassley serves as that. You see the Republican leadership laid out, right? You have the whips, right? These are the people kind of in charge of whipping votes, right, or getting votes together, of herding all the cats and the members of Congress into kind of voting the way that they should on this legislation. And of course, you have the Democratic leadership on the right, right? So you have the majority and minority leader, right, in the Senate, where just like in the House, but in the Senate, right, the majority leader is basically essentially the speaker equivalent in terms of power here. And so you have all these people, right, working to create legislation for their own party, right, and occasionally working together to get stuff done. And it's been remarkable, right? One of the stories of the last half century or so, changes in how often you see people, essentially from the left side of the slide, work with the people on the right side of the slide. So there's a lot going on in this, right? But if you look at the blue and red bars, these are the percent of Democrats voting with the party majority. That's voting with the majority of their party. Over time, all the way back to Eisenhower's the 1950s, you see this slowly rise a bit, right? Not dramatically, it's always been high, right? Hovering around 80, but now it's roughly 90, if not more. That is, members of Congress are very commonly voting with their own party and often not voting with the other. So you can see the yellow bar is the percent of party unity votes, right? Where you have the parties completely united, right? In terms of who they're voting with. So with all Democrats voting together and all Republicans voting together, and this also is rising a bit. And you can loosen this a little bit where it's not 100% unity, right, is if you look at the percent of votes where 90% of each party is voting in opposition to the other party, with the House being the solid line, right, and the Senate being the dotted line, right. This has risen quite dramatically since the 70s, where it's almost never true in the 70s, but today, right, you can see sometimes in the House, right, a majority, right, also close to a majority in the Senate, or at least a plurality in the Senate here. And so these party divisions, right, have gotten much more stark in voting, right, as the party whip structure, as the party is central to it. And importantly, party control has changed a bit. So we talked a bit about party history last week, right? So the majority party in the Senate has flip-flopped back and forth kind of since the 80s, with the Republicans and Democrats and Republicans, and going back and forth in terms of who controls the majority in the chamber. And in fact, in the House, right, for much of the 20th century, the Democrats dominated in terms of the majority. And then more recently, we've gone back and forth a little bit in terms of who's had a majority, with the Democrats, right, retaking this in 2018. So there's lots, right, to discuss here in terms of what's going on, right, and how these divides shape it. But in particular, as the parties have gotten more distinct and more separate from one another, they've shaped what Congress actually does in a number of ways, some of which we'll talk about in the next video, but some of it we'll talk about right here. And in particular, if you look at the House, right, and this is an ideology scale here, right, so from liberal to conservative, with liberal being kind of lower on the plot, more conservative being higher on the plot. And again, we saw some of this polarization in the opening slide, but we see since the 1960s and 70s, right, Republicans have gotten dramatically more conservative on average, and particularly in the House. And some of the stories we discussed last week about the shifting coalitional dynamics of the New Deal coalition in the 1960s, as you can see the regional divide for Democrats, with it kind of coming back together today, where there's not as clear a regional divide between Democrats and Republicans. Whereas before, right, Northern Democrats were quite a bit more liberal than Southern Democrats because of that shift around civil rights. If you look to the Senate, you see a similar story, maybe slightly less polarization or kind of less extreme, particularly on the Republican side, but you still see, right, a really sharp increase in terms of this divide since the middle of the 20th century. And it leaves us, right, with the opening slide that we saw, where today we have in both the House and Senate really stark divides between the two parties, which means they spend a lot of time, right, messaging against each other, right, trying to get control of the chamber, because so much power rests in who the majority is, some of which we'll talk about in the next video. If you want to look through the whole history of the U.S. here, right, the whole history of the Republican and Democratic parties, as well as the other parties before that, right, you can see that today, right, is highly polarized. Maybe not the highest it's ever been, right, but the dynamics, right, are quite a bit different and create quite a lot of problems for how the chamber functions. So how did we get to this polarized divide? So should note, right, we can go into a lot of depth here, but I don't want to go into too much depth, right? So I'm teaching another class titled Political Polarization this quarter, but there are many kind of mechanisms that we could point to here. One, right, is this idea of gerrymandering or gerrymandering and redistricting, right, is that many districts, right, are very red or very blue, right, very Republican or very Democratic today as they get redrawn. You could see some of this, but right, the Senate, we don't redraw the state lines, and still there's polarization there. Yet, of course, some of this could feed into just the parties behaving in strategic ways given this. But largely it just makes, right, gerrymandering and everything else, right, sitting members safer in future elections, keeps incumbency rates high. It wouldn't necessarily kind of push polarization, although it might a bit. We also discussed, right, last week about how parties have shifted, right, where before you had a number of conservative Democrats in the 50s, 60s, right, and 70s, and those members have slowly been not reelected, right, or left the chamber for various other reasons, so that you see the parties kind of better sorted on ideology. That is, before there were always a mix of conservative and liberal people, but they often spanned the two parties, and each party was not as distinct ideologically. There have also been a number of rules changes, right? As parties, right, and the divides become starker, right, we see that the majority party now has a lot more power bound up in it, right? When the parties are divided, I mean, we see that more people, right, are willing to give more power to their party leadership because you can see the divisions. And there's some reasons to think, right, that some of these reforms have definitely kind of exacerbated the problem of polarization, but it may be not the only cause, right? There's a complex kind of loop here. A good point to us, right, whether it's our fault, that's electoral connection, right, is that we have been pushing for more conservative or liberal policies depending on the district. It's true we're less polarized in Congress, but of course, right, when you look at activists, when you look at the people donating and the people kind of pushing for particular things, right, those people, those loudest voices are often more polarized than the voices of the people that don't necessarily kind of aren't very active. So some of this comes up, right, increased primary competition. So in primary elections where members, right, the parties get selected to run in the first place, right, we can see some evidence of this. But again, there's reasons to wonder why it wouldn't have happened with party bosses pre-reform. You can point to rising, right, I mentioned donors already, but rising kind of wealth inequality, right, and money in Congress, right, pulling people, members of Congress, towards powerful interests and what they want to do. And there's reasons to think some of this, right? But it's clear that there's not one singular answer when we talk about polarization, but in fact that we see a lot of factors, right, contributing to this feedback loop of increasing partisan polarization. And importantly, this divide itself is not necessarily the outcome we care about, but the fact that it causes other outcomes for how Congress works. In particular, stark party divides, right, have increased, right, gridlock, right, and basically the inability to get anything done in Congress, or fewer things done here, which could be problematic if Congress actually needs to get things done that are pressing and need to happen in an urgent manner. Although, right, remember the framers' intentions from the last video is you don't necessarily want a too active Congress. It does mean, right, that there are much starker choices for voters today. That is, most people, right, kind of know what Republicans stand for, or Democrats stand for. Not everyone, of course, right, but it's much easier to kind of know where you stand because the parties don't overlap at all, and in fact have very distinct agendas. There has been increased polarization in terms of emotional, right? So affective is kind of the technical term here, right? Is that we think about Democrats hating Republicans or Republicans hating Democrats, particularly members of Congress, right? Don't get along like they used to, that many members decry, right? Is it's less social, they're less friendly towards one another. We also see a lot of legislation that's passed or attempted to be passed, not because necessarily it's good policy, but to make the other party look bad, to make them go on record as not supporting something quite popular or supporting something unpopular, right? And a lot of strategy centered around this communication because party control of the chamber is so important that you always want to be in the majority. And if you're in the minority, you do everything you can to regain power. So a lot of these shifts, right, are they good? It's hard to say they are in many ways, right, because they can create a lot of dysfunction. And in particular, the argument might be that polarization itself may be not the problem, right? And there are some reasons to think that's positive, but partisan warfare, right, where the incentives of the members to behave in absolutely nasty ways, right, and try to play off each other to get their goals, can be problematic. And to highlight this, right, there have been a number of authors, right, detailing these problems, right, you can read millions of op-eds, but to kind of give a picture of the landscape, right, so there's a book written in 2006 by Tom Mann and Norm Ornstein, right, so relatively liberal and conservative, right, think tank authors, write this book together, noting how Congress is broken and should be fixed. Then a few years later, right, they write a book called It's Even Worse Than It Looks. And then they update that book in 2016 and note that it's even worse than it was, right, that these problems are not going away, and that dysfunction is basically the current status of Congress in many ways. I should note, right, we'll revisit polarization, right, and these divides. We talk about us and how divided we actually are in terms of our opinions and how this feeds into the electoral process later in the quarter. So with that, thanks for listening. And look forward to speaking with you about the actual, right, process of making legislation in the next video. Thanks so much.